Brendon Summers went through a brief inspection at the checkpoint, took one last look at the huge county jail building, and stepped out the gate. Of course, there was no one waiting for him on the other side. Brandon's parents died in a car accident, and he was raised by his grandmother from the age of 5. Unfortunately, Charlotte Summers didn't live long enough to see her grandson's release from prison. Brandon wasn't a hardened criminal. He got his term for petty fraud. His head was always full of brilliant ideas on how to get rich at the expense of others. However, unlike those involved in financial pyramids, Brandon never left people with nothing and always gave them hope. Nevertheless, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to a rather severe punishment. Fortunately, that was now in the past, and the first thing Brandon wanted to do was buy a house. Thanks to the inheritance he got from his grandmother, the ex-con had some money in his bank account. After renting a motel room, Brandon bought a local newspaper with property listings and started his search. Real estate in Ohio could hardly be called cheap, and at some point it seemed that finding a suitable option would be simply impossible. And when Brandon had almost completely lost hope, he came across a very interesting listing. In connection with the move, a house outside the city is for sale. The price is below market, but there are some inconveniences. The man read, silently moving his lips. The more Brandon looked at the ad, the more he liked it. Interesting. I wonder what those inconveniences are. What could it be? Anyways, I should definitely check it out at least. The ex-con thought, dialing the number from the listing. The seller of the house turned out to be a man, and he immediately invited Brandon to see the house. The man's voice sounded rather desperate. He was clearly in dire need of money. Upon arrival at the address, Brandon was pleasantly surprised. Despite the fact that the house was located outside the city, it looked absolutely fine and didn't arouse any suspicions. But when the owner of the house arrived, Brandon immediately became alert. The man looked rather unpleasant, and his movements were all fussy and nervous. Brandon knew from experience that such behavior was characteristic of alcoholics and gamblers. "My name is Floyd Miller. Let's get straight to the point. Would you like to inspect the house from the inside, sir?" the owner asked, hiding his eyes. "No, what is there to see? I can already tell that the house is in good condition, and the price it's at is twice below the market value. What are the inconveniences that you mentioned in the ad?" Brandon asked in turn. His question made the owner tense up visibly and run his hand through his greasy hair. Thus, realizing the man was waiting for a response, he answered quietly, "Well, my mother still lives in this house. She's old and weak. I wanted to move her to a nursing home, but she refused to go. So I'm selling the house with her. Let her stay here a while longer, and then you can decide what to do with her. That's why the house is so cheap." At first, Brandon thought that he must have misheard the man, and that his mind was playing tricks on him. But then he looked into Floyd's eyes and realized that he wasn't joking. "Sure, no problem. Let her stay for now. The house is big, so there's enough room for everyone," Brandon said, recovering from the initial shock. Then the man gave Floyd the money and got the paperwork from him. As soon as Floyd got the money, he quickly said goodbye and hurried off towards the nearest bus stop. Meanwhile, Brandon opened the door with his key and stepped inside the house, taking a look around. Despite the fact that the house clearly hadn't been renovated in a while, it looked quite cozy. There was no dust on the floors and walls, which meant that it was cleaned regularly. Going from room to room, Brandon reached the room occupied by the elderly mother of the former owner of the house. Seeing the stranger in the doorway, Rosemary Miller turned pale and stepped back involuntarily. The old woman had long been accustomed to the antics of her somewhat strange son, but even she didn't expect him to sell the house with her in it. "Don't worry, ma'am. I won't put you out on the street. You can stay here as long as you need. I'm lonely, and there's enough room here for the both of us," Brandon said, catching the woman's gaze. Mrs. Miller relaxed visibly and smiled timidly at the new owner of the house. Her son Floyd was an alcoholic who, among other things, loved gambling and betting. For this very reason, there was never any money in his family, and he could no longer deal with his debt without selling the house. At first, Rosemary Miller treated Brendon with a fair amount of distrust. She could feel that the man had a difficult past and that he had to go through many trials. Meanwhile, Brendon behaved quite naturally and never did anything to offend the old woman, who turned out to be a sweet and kind person. To the surprise of Rosemary Miller, living under the same roof with Brendon wasn't actually as scary as she expected at first. The new owner was an attentive and caring person who was always ready to go on a pharmacy run for her or call the doctor. Moreover, Brendon always took care of all the expenses associated with the woman's treatment. The ex-con probably saw his late grandmother in Rosemary Miller, and he loved his grandmother deeply. Deprived of parental affection and warmth, the man was drawn to Mrs. Miller like a flower to the sun. The old woman didn't even realize when she started feeling much better, blossoming right in front of Brendon's eyes. The illnesses receded, and Mrs. Miller got to enjoy her life again. Now, when Brendon went to work, she cooked for him, did the laundry, and cleaned the house. The old woman was used to the indifference of her son, but taking care of the new owner of the house felt very different. Being a smart and far-sighted man, Brendon took into account the mistakes of his past and firmly decided to be done with criminal life once and for all. The determined man soon got a loan at the bank and opened a small construction company, which started bringing in a small but stable income in just 1 month. Fortunately, despite his extensive experience in accounting, Brendon was completely unable to solve his personnel issues. The people he hired turned out to be either lazy or alcoholics. Tired of endless problems with the staff, Brendon shared his worries with Mrs. Miller. The old woman listened attentively and then said, "Let me sit in on the interviews. I think I can help you. I used to work in a recruiting company many years ago, and I'm good at reading people." Brendon raised an eyebrow in surprise and smiled. In the depths of his soul, the man didn't believe that Mrs. Miller could help him, but he didn't want to offend the old woman by rejecting her offer. So he took Mrs. Miller to work with him the very next day. To Brendon's great surprise, the old woman immediately identified the laziest worker, who didn't just refuse to do any actual work, but also stole building materials from the warehouse. "I think you should fire him. Trust me, my son Floyd made the same look when he did something bad," Mrs. Miller added. Brendon thanked the old lady and did as she recommended. Thanks to her advice, the man managed to avoid losing money on the construction materials, which were very expensive. Now that Mrs. Miller was helping Brendon, his business immediately took off. The old woman interviewed the candidates and unmistakably hired only the best of them. Thanks to her help, Brendon's firm grew and expanded, receiving new orders from construction and repair work. One day, a man came to Brendon's office looking for a job. His shifty eyes and trembling hands made it obvious that he had an alcohol abuse problem and that he was so desperate that he even decided to get a job as a handyman at a construction site. At first, Brendon didn't realize who that man was, but Mrs. Miller immediately recognized him. It was Floyd. He came to ask for help and a job. He spent the money he got from selling the house a long time ago, so he needed to earn a living. The most surprising thing was that he never once visited his mother in all this time. Moreover, he never even called her. And now he stood in front of his mother and looked into her eyes. Mrs. Miller frowned and then said, "I don't think we should hire this man, Brendon. He is a lazy, petty swindler." Floyd's face made it obvious that it wasn't the answer he expected to get. The man's lips quivered and sweat broke out on his forehead. Still hoping that his mother would help him, the man stood in the middle of the office and waited for Brendon's decision. But the owner of the firm shook his head and pointed Floyd to the door. Feeling squeamish, Brendon watched the man who valued money more than his own mother leave his office. The businessman approached Mrs. Miller and put his arm around her shoulders, thus letting her know that he approved her decision. Meanwhile, Floyd left the office and headed downtown. The man felt disappointed, and for the first time in his life, he seemed to have realized that he'd made a huge mistake. Having betrayed his own mother, Floyd destroyed their relationship, and there was no turning back for him. Rosemary Miller no longer considered him her son, choosing to give all of her love and affection to Brendon. Together, they managed to achieve great success with the company and soon became wealthy. About a year later, Brendon brought home a woman whom Mrs. Miller liked at first sight. Looking at the young couple with love, the old woman was sure that they would live a long and happy life together and that they would cherish and respect each other.